Hello, I'm Deb Bedwell, and I want to welcome you to Let's Make a Tile Part 2, which really is Let's Decorate a Tile. When we were working in Part 1, we rolled out a 6-inch porcelain tile and we cut it, moved it to the back of our drying board, which is a piece of drywall or wallboard. And it's nice and dry now, and we're going to decorate it with commercial underglaze. When we left off last time, we had used the tar paper as a template and cut our tile out with the pizza cutter as you remember, and it made a nice even thickness from throwing the slab, flinging the slab, rolling it out between two guides. And we have a nice, little bit drier than leather hard tile. Flip it. I'm going to set it over here at the back of this nice piece of drywall, which is our work surface. I do have another one that is dry from a few days ago, and I'd like to just show you what we have to do to prepare a tile to paint. So there are some tools that I have. I have some brushes, and you can see from a still image that each one makes a different mark. I have a sgraffito tool. It has a little knife on one end, a little triangle X-Acto knife. I don't know if you can see it. Let's put it down here. There it goes, a little triangle X-Acto knife and a little scoop. What you don't want to use for sgraffito is a needle tool, because when you do that, you raise a burr on either side of the mark that the needle tool makes. We don't want that. So we use the little scoop or the knife to make a mark through the color. I have some underglaze color. You see them here in the bottles. They are actually Amico underglaze color, the Velvet series that comes in the 2-ounce jar, the pint jar, and even a gallon jar if you want. You can make your own underglaze with about 5% Mason stain to your throwing slip. Make sure that the stain is added to water, and then that water and stain go into the slip. And I've done that with a bright turquoise that's called peacock green Mason stain. So I have a bunch of stains, and I've put them in these bottles because I like to trail, which is to use the bottles almost like a cake decorator, and I'll show you that. Also, it keeps them nice and fresh in the bottle, and I top the bottle off with a little push pin, not all the way down. I don't want to stretch the opening, but I do want to make a nice firm closing, and a push pin is just perfect. A map pin with the little ball on top works also. So I have push pins in the bottles. I have the bottles that are mostly open. I have the brushes. I have a Sureform tool, which is very important. And then I have over on the side, which you can't necessarily see, is a sponge and some water, which I use as well. To get started, let's look at a tile that we have cut. And you see that the edges are pretty sharp. They are sharp, and they have a little bit of leftover clay, a little margin that's left from the cutting. We're going to remove that, first of all, with the Sureform tool, and it's an easy matter just to scrape with the Sureform tool. A cheese grater works. Any kind of a rasp will work, but what you're doing is creating a little bevel along here, and you can kind of round the corners. I'm going to continue just to use this like bevel the edges, take away any excess clay. round the corners a little bit, bevel those edges. And the motion is a diagonal one across the edges, not necessarily up and down like that, but just across the edges and all the way through. Makes a very nice surface for the hand to touch. Around the corners and down those edges. And then to do a super thorough job, I'm going to flip it and do it on the other side as well. Now, after you've completed the job with the short form tool, there's one other step you can take to make this very, very nice. And I've reached over here and I've wet my sponge, a great big sponge, and it's not very wet. You can see it's wet. You can see that I can wipe up my work surface here, but it's not dripping by any means. And you can rub these edges, kind of putting your finger on either side of the sponge and really rub these edges. And the clay dust that's there will make a kind of slip, and it makes a lovely silky surface for that corner and those edges. And so we're going to get started by just using a brush that makes a very nice brush print, and that is a square shader. I am inspired, and you can be inspired too, by the things around you that you encounter every day. And one of the things I have and that I'm inspired by are patchwork quilts. I'm going to go straight ahead with the underglaze color and use my square shader and mix this pale turquoise, it's not so pale, and fill up my square shader. And I'm going to make what I call a brush print. It's not even a stroke, but what it does is allows the color, the material, the underglaze to soak into the tile a little bit without making a huge mark. And what I love about this is the way that the underglaze sort of collects itself, it puddles, and then we get a really nuanced surface here. We get a lot of dark turquoise, and we get some light turquoise, and we get some almost invisible color. I'm going to add a little more underglaze to my palette because it seems a little thin. So the square shader, this is about a 1-inch square shader. So if I have a patchwork quilt, this may be sort of like a checkerboard. And down 3 up. I can get a good bit of color on each stroke. It doesn't matter if it's exactly the same size, even if the position is a little off register. That's kind of makes it interesting. So there we have a basic structure. We don't have to worry, is it a dog or a cat, or it looks like a leaf or a branch. It's just a basic structure. So if this were a patchwork quilt, the next thing I might want to try is a kind of stitching. Let's say we want to stitch these pieces of fabric onto the back of the quilt. So to stitch, I might make a diagonal stitch, a little needle and thread kind of thing here. So I'm going to use the point of my sgraffito tool And I'm just going to scratch through the color. And when I do that, I'm going to come out of the block and aim for the next block so that there is a visual connectedness. Now, this is just my way of decorating. There are hundreds of ways of decorating, even hundreds of ways of decorating with underglaze color. You don't have to do it this way by any means. I like to use sgraffito, however, because it allows the white of the clay to come through, and it begins to connect the white spaces with the turquoise spaces. And you notice I'm not blowing this away every time I make a scratch, because I like to set up a kind of rhythm. You can hear it. That's very satisfying to me, because the sound of that sgraffito tool dovetails with the visual mark that I am making. There, I'm finished. Let's see what we have. A lot of dust on the surface, but we can brush that away. It's a little bit wet. Don't want to hurt anything. You can see how that looks. Now that water that's on this brush is going to dry in just a second. Okay, so now we have these little marks on there, and that helps to connect these turquoise squares with the white squares beside it. I think we can emphasize that even a little more by using our liner brush. And I use a lot of outlining when I'm applying the underglaze to the tile. I have a very favorite liner brush. It's very soft, long bristles, not too many of them. So I'm going to wet the brush so that capillary action will pull the color down toward the ferrule of the brush. And I'm going to use the dark turquoise. And I'll test it out here just on, there's that stroke, a nice little stroke. And I'm going to outline the squares. And when I do that, the line will be very fluid, and we can use that fluid line to connect the squares again in a number of different ways. And if it skips over the little sgraffito marks, even better. This is a very casual outline, and you see these begin to connect already, and that creates another kind of space which you can make a mark. So you don't have to be worried about the quote painting on the tile. You can let the brush just do the work for you. Good brushes are very important. They don't all have to be expensive, but they can't be junk. There. So now we've outlined our quilt squares. We've made some stitching, and I think we can use a little bit of white to provide some movement in this quilt we have. And again, this is wonderful stuff, this wallboard. You can just draw on it and then wipe it off with a sponge. It doesn't last real long if you want to spend a whole lot of time wiping and washing, but for a painting session, it's just great. So I'm going to use the white underglaze in a trailing bottle, and you can see that it will come right out. And we're thinking about this in sewing. This is like a sewing machine applique or a pattern that you would make in the quilt. It goes over those little sgraffito marks, and kind of, those are broken up. Done. Okay, so now we've got some diagonals this way, diagonals that way, some squares and structure, and the outlines, which are kind of loosely reinforcing the structure. Now, I would like to incorporate at this point something that is very different from this square and line thing, and that is I would like to incorporate a little bit of a botanical reference. I love leaves and vines, and I like to include them as images in my application of underglaze and the brushwork. So I'm just going to use the Sumi brush, which is so great. The brush print, just let me put it down here and show you. The brush print just makes a leaf all by itself. So I'm going to put some leaves in here. I'm going to tuck them into the white space. The white spaces right now are pretty boring, so we're going to put those in. There we go. There's one. And we'll turn it this way. So there's two. And a couple that way. And maybe one here. Pretty random, but kind of intentional at the same time. I know that sounds like a dichotomy, but maybe a third one? No, I don't think so. These are nice. Just pop them in wherever you see a space that looks a little bit naked. There we go. Okay, now we have that, the Sumi brush, and we have this leaf pattern that's all through it. All of this ties the piece together. Finally, I'm going to put some red dots in here just to kind of liven it up. And maybe I'll also take the knife part of my sgraffito tool and go in a kind of oppositional way to the quilt stitching. So I might just pull a line through the leaf here and there. Now there's a lot of wet underglaze here, so I'm going to be careful not to get the crumbs of clay. Okay, so that's enough of that. And we can now do some red dots. I love red dots. We'll just put a few here and there, like they were berries, or their punctuation. Just a couple here and there. Some along those margins, some at the end of the leaves, some at the ends of the stitching, a few here and there. I like them especially at these intersections of the outline. It's almost like we've created little boxes for them. So I would say this tile is finished. I like that little line, though, of red ones. Maybe I'll put another line of red ones and have it go down. Maybe one up here. Fill that little square. Are there any other little squares? Not really. There's a little space. Any other spaces? No. I think we've got it. Maybe. Enough. Okay? Easy to overdo. So this is a finished tile. Now what happens now? This tile is greenware. It needs to be bisque fired. The glaze needs to be applied. It needs to be fired to cone 10 in the gas kiln. So we're going to allow this to dry. Then I'll put a signature mark on the back, and then I'll pack it for transport to Baltimore Clay Works and firing.